as the recording begins. So we are looking at intermediate code generation, right, which is somewhere in between the source code and the final code that we want to generate, right? So neither the humans nor the machine understand this code, right? But the compiler understands this code. And it's important for the compiler to perform certain optimizations, certain analysis, certain transformations, which is a little difficult to do at the source code level. Some analysis are still performed at the source code level. Analysis meaning you want to extract some information from the program. For example, if I want to figure out if there are dependencies across different variables in the program, which might be helpful from the perspective of identifying how long the program might take in terms of number of instructions executed, or it might be helpful from parallelization perspective, or I want to find out what is the worst case execution time of a program. Alternatively, I might be interested in figuring out approximately how much energy this particular program might take, right? So for different instructions, the hardware, that is the ISA associated with the hardware, so the hardware vendor comes up with that this particular instruction under normal circumstances, that is the temperature is maintained, the cooling around the machine is maintained at this particular temperature, then this particular instruction takes this much amount of energy. And you might be able to perform at the assembly code level that these are the instructions that are likely to get executed in the longest run, and therefore the worst case execution time as well as worst case execution energy could be like this, and so on. There are different kinds of, for example, I can perform a memory analysis where I might say that this particular program, although it has recursion, in the worst case this might take this much, assuming that the inputs are bounded by this, and so on. So all of these are different kinds of analysis that you could perform either at the source code level or at the assembly level. But by and large, most of the analysis do get performed at the intermediate code generation level. So whatever compiler is able to perform automatically, typically that gets coded at the IR level. Right? And IR is considered to be one of the very important parts of a compiler, primarily because most of the optimizations get into there. Right? And those are machine independent, because currently I don't know, I have not generated the code yet. And therefore, these are any optimizations that we do here are going to be machine independent. Plus, this is source independent in the sense that I can have the same IR for multiple languages. For example, I can have C, C++, boiling down to the same IR, right, in GCC, or even Fortran for that example, for that matter. So once I have built in a framework for optimizations at the IR level, I might be able to apply it to multiple source code languages. What I need to have is a sort of compiler or front end of the compiler which converts from, let's say, Fortran and C to the same IR. The backend is probably going to be the same as we discussed in the initial lectures. All right, so let's move ahead. So in our overall flow of the compiler, we are in this fourth block, IR generation, which takes in a syntax tree which has done some sort of semantic analysis, which means that you now know a little bit about types. You have probably figured out some of the meanings of certain mnemonics, right? For example, based on the type, you might be able to make some distinction across different variables and so on, right? Incidentally, we might lose that information in the intermediate code generation, which means that I'll not worry too much about the types as such. Of course, the type information is going to be there in the symbol table, but I might not worry about it too much, right, in the IR representation. All right, so our agenda is that we are going to look at different forms of IR. Can there be 3 address code? Can there be 2 address code, 1 address code, etc.? And we are going to look at a specific form of IR, which is static single assignment, or SSA. And then we will try to generate IR for different constructs. For example, various types. Not that we are going to generate as such an IR, but we need to still worry about it because there is some execution or some executable part which comes into picture. Even if I say that I am declaring a three-dimensional matrix, then I need to worry about how am I going to generate code for that matrix of I, J, K. Right? So because at the hardware level, it's a single dimensional array. Right? The memory is just has different addresses. It doesn't have any dimensions associated. At least the CPU memory that we know of. And therefore, we'll have to worry about types. Then we'll have to worry about declarations. I need to create some space for various variables either on stack or heap and so on. Then I need to worry about assignment statements, conditional loops, and so on. So that's going to be our agenda. So let's formalize the role of IR generator. So it acts as a glue between the front end and the back end, and it lowers the abstraction from the source code. Source code is really at the very abstract level. It should be actually very close to the problem definition. That is, you are given a problem, and to solve that problem, you have an algorithm which you are going to implement in the source code. That implementation should be as close to the problem statement as possible. And that is where your abstractions come into picture. You might have functions, you might have classes, you might have different types which are related to the problem that you are solving. Right? We typically, when we are trying to solve the problem, the class names refer to a particular problem that we are solving. The compiler doesn't understand what a student means. But from the problem definition, if it is related to academics, then you will have a student class and so on. And that makes life simple. Whose life simple? Not the programmers. Programmers' life is simple at the abstraction level, right? At the abstract level, that is at the source code level. But this makes the life of a compiler a little easy. The reason being that if I ask all of you to write a for loop, right, which goes over, let's say, an array and prints all the elements in that array, there will be minor distinctions with respect to even this simple for loop. Right? Somebody will include space, somebody will include multiple declarations using comma separation, somebody will have printf, somebody will have probably some other function, somebody will do pretty printing and so on. So all of these changes come into picture when different people write it at the source code level. We would like to have some sort of representation which is by and large going to give almost the same IR, barring these simple syntactic changes. Right? So that makes the life of a compiler a little simpler. However, we don't want to lower it too much. When you lower it too much, almost at the assembly level, then all the high level information is gone. At the assembly level, there is no distinction between whether you are talking about an integer or a structure. In fact, the structure may not exist at the assembly level. Right? These are all different fields of basic types which are there, which are just bunched together. Right? So you might be able to even access the second field of a structure using an indexing form, right? I mean, in the sense that array-like form, a of 0, a of 1, and so on, like that. So you lose that high-level information, right? You might not have even information about functions in some assembly codes. You might just have a goto. So there is a bunch of statements, and then you just go to a particular label, and that is like calling a function. So all of these high level information you still require. Why do you require that high level information? Is because you want to have some interesting life. What is that interesting life? Well, you want to perform certain optimizations at that level, right? You want to analyze the program. So it still maintains some high level information, but not to the extent of assembly level. I mean, not to the extent of source code, but not too low level as assembly code. So it performs some syntactic checks, and I'm calling those as syntactic checks which go beyond your context-free part, and then perform some semantic checks which you might want to do. And primarily, you can perform optimizations here. Right? So like we were discussing about the break should be inside loop or switch only, that you can perform here also. Right? You can perform it as part of the SDT. Right? But SDT is like associated action, and you can make use of, so if this semantic analysis is a separate pass compared to the IR generation, then you might perform these checks, some syntactic checks in the semantic part itself. Alternatively, if you have glued together these, because these are going to be part of the same action part of your YAG grammar, then this can still come inside this IR generation. So let's talk about these various representations. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's represent that. So one of the ways in which it can actually be represented, the IR could be represented, is to use syntax trees themselves. So whatever syntax analysis as well as semantic analysis gave us, use those syntax trees. So it maintains the structure of the construct. Right? You will also notice that if you have a sort of looping structure which you want to maintain in the form of abstract syntax tree, you have to have some sort of mnemonic which says that there is a for loop or a while loop. But if you don't have that, if you just keep track of that it's a loop, then from the syntax tree representation, you cannot go back to whether it was a for loop or a while loop. Well, it doesn't matter, but you cannot get back exactly the same source code. Right? So there is no guarantee. So that stops mattering at the IR level. You are just interested in figuring out that it was a loop. So syntax tree is quite useful when you want to maintain that high level structure. And some of the research compilers do use syntax trees to represent this intermediate code. But by and large, this is not the one that gets used in most of the compilers. What we use, yeah, so that syntax tree example is like this. So what we use is the 3 address code, right? What that means is that you can have maximum 3 addresses in any instruction, right? Any intermediate representation instruction. Intermediate representation itself is a language, right? Your source code is a language, assembly code is a language, machine code is a language, your intermediate representation is also a language, right? And that has a certain form. Just that it is a simpler form. So it has maximum 3 addresses in an instruction. Whereas at the source code level, I can have something like A equal to B plus C star D into E and so on, right? So I can have an arbitrary set of addresses specified as part of the source code. But in 3 address code, I'll have to break it into multiple 3 address code instructions. So that is somewhere in between the high level and low level, because at the assembly code, maybe it will allow me 1 or at max 2 addresses and something like that. So at the higher level, this is okay. So this particular expression that I have, 3 into 5 plus 4, that I can convert using 3 address code like this. So I have a temporary T1, which gets the value of 3 into 5, and then T1 plus 4 gives me the final value, which I store inside T2. So T1 and T2 are different temporaries which are generated by the compiler, and this turns out to be my 3 address code. Right. Any questions on 3 address code? We'll generate 3 address code for various constructs later, but just to understand this particular example. Okay. If there are no questions, can you convert this into 2 address code? So 2 address code means that I can have maximum 2 addresses per instruction. Addresses meaning it need not only be addresses. For example, even 3 and 5 are kind of constants. So even those need to be marked as an address. So can somebody tell me a 2 address code corresponding to this?
Sir? Sir?
Is somebody talking?
Sir, I had a doubt.
The Venkat is talking. Just a minute, Venkat.
Sir, like when we are talking about three address code, like per instruction, we can have like I didn't get what we mean by an address. Can you explain that part again?
Yeah. So I think I have it later on the slide, but just to give you a high level information, what that means is that a constant or a variable, that is an address associated with a variable, you can have maximum three of them. Essentially, that means that you can have maximum three operands in an expression, right? So in this case, T1 is an address, 3 is an address for us, it's an operand, and 5 is an address for our discussion. And therefore, we will say that maximum 3 instructions, operands exist in this case, therefore, this becomes an example of 3 address code. Similarly, for the second instruction. So you cannot have, for example, 3 into 5 plus 4 that assigned to T1, because that will become a 4 address code.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so Naveen has written something. T1 equal to 3, T1 T1 star equal to 5. Okay. Okay, T2 equal to T1 and T2 plus equal to 4. Okay, sounds fine as such. So you might wonder that star equal to and plus equal to are syntactic gimmicks at the source code level, but you might have an intermediate representation which allows this. And in fact, it will be required. This is a very important point. And let me see the others and I'll explain that little. T1 equal to 3, T1 star 5, yes, T2 plus 4. Ram Prasad 3, T1 into 5, T equal to T1, T equal to T1, T2 plus 4. Okay, right. So all of you got it in the same manner. And that's very important, that when you are getting into two address code, there is something implicit which is going to come, because for a binary operator, you are going to require two operands. But then you cannot have the resultant address. And that requires you to have one of those two addresses as the resultant. Right? And therefore, there is an implicit accumulation of information which is happening in one particular address, right? So, and therefore, this is called as an accumulator based instruction code, address code. So in this case, for example, T1 or T2, they were acting as an accumulator. In fact, many of the hardware do have this notion of an accumulator, as you might have studied. Why are we considering constants as addresses? So there is a reason behind it. The reason being that all of these operands you are going to store, right? It's not that you are going to actually store this as a string, that the way we are showing. You will say that this was the opcode, and then these are the 3 or 2 addresses, or these are the 3 operands which you are going to use. And in the tabular manner, you will keep them. Right? And therefore, you need to push constant also as an operand. So therefore, we call it as an address, but that is more from the representation perspective, how you are going to store. So what I was saying is that you need to have some sort of accumulation happening, and as I was mentioning, Intel codes or even some of the other machines, you will have accumulator register, right? AX, etc. I don't know if you have done it as part of this RISC-V system, but yeah, that on the Intel machines, AX turns out to be an accumulator, which means that many of the instructions take AX implicitly and leave the result implicitly into AX, right? And that removes the burden of specifying AX as part of the instruction, right? Specifying a particular register as part of the instruction. Right? So that is what essentially these two address code required, and all the answers that have come essentially refer to a particular operand implicitly. So that's an important point, right? And that should be thought about, because I'm going to force you to write in one address code form also. Right? So the two address code will look something like this. So there was mention of this T1 deriving T1 into 5, etc. What I'm going to do write it in a slightly different manner, where I'm going to use an accumulator to do all the processing. So mult3 5 is going to take operand 3, operand 5, and push their result into a particular register. Right? Using that register, I am going to do add 4 and so on. Right? So this is not exactly the proper format. Ideally, I should have done something like move 3 or load 3, not load but move 3 maybe, and then mult 5 and then add 4 and so on. Well, that is also, that is, yeah, that is something else which anyway we are going to discuss. Okay, so but anyway, as far as this is concerned, this seems to be okay, that the output is going to be specified implicitly as part of the input. So that is our 2-address code. Now I am going to ask you, what if we want to apply something to the accumulator? That is what. So it becomes a little bit of challenge that you have to have instructions which are going to use accumulator implicitly. If you want to use accumulator register, for example, then you have to move that information to some other register or to memory, and then free up the accumulator and use it. So that's why many of these instruction sets will also tell you that don't use accumulator for your regular purpose. Of course, if you are writing actually in assembly code, you will exactly know where all information is, and you will be able to move AX to some other register, let's say BX, or to some memory location and do it. So that is not a problem. But yeah, you will have to store it somewhere. Okay, so now write the code for this computation 3 into 5 plus 4 using one address code specification. Yeah, you got the answer correct. As I was mentioning, whatever I was mentioning was actually in the, okay, move 3 mult 5, push 3 mult 5, add 4. Yeah, add 3 5 times. Yeah, so you got it correct. So now you can see that there is an operand, there is an operator and one of the operands, right? The number of operands for an operator could be 0, 1, 2, etc. In this case, we have to, as soon as it is 0 or 1, you are able to do it in with one address code. But if it is 2, then you have to now implicitly assume an input which is also going to go into the output. And that is going to be typically an accumulator. Alternatively, it can be something else also, right? And that push 3 kind of gives a hint of where those operands can go. Right? Okay, so that's what I am showing here. So either you can use an accumulator, or you can push instructions, push the operands onto a stack, and then apply operations onto them. So push 3, push 5 is going to push those two, and then mult is just going to take top 2 elements from the stack, multiply, and then store the result again onto the stack top. Right? Push 4 is going to then push 4 value, and then add is going to just pop elements, 2 elements, and push the result back. Right? This is very similar to how we did postfix expression evaluation. Right? So it's actually in a similar form. Does anybody know if that one address code is of theoretical interest, or does it actually get used somewhere? Okay, very good. And why does it rely on such a low level machine? Java is quite recent. I mean, in the 90s it came up. So why did they decide to use a stack-based machine? Right. So what Rudha has suggested is important, that they wanted Java to run on across all platforms, right? And Different platforms may not support different functionalities, for example different registers and so on, and therefore you require some sort of JVM to execute that bytecode. But that bytecode you should be able to run efficiently. For that, what is the bare minimum you can expect from that machine? So they decided that, I mean, you can do away with the stack based thing also. You might actually use a different intermediate representation which does not require a stack, but they felt that okay, at least memory is going to be there, so some sort of stacking is going to be possible, and therefore they decided to use a stacked machine. Then mult used two addresses again. Mult instruction doesn't use it. It does implicitly assume that it uses two addresses. That is the two stack tops. It is not part of the instruction. We never specified it right, like that. In fact, in many of these, there will be multiple instances of such mult instructions supported, right? So the there will be mult3 also supported and mult also supported. So mult will just do for two stack top. Mult3 will take one stack top and do it right, in one address code because that is allowed. So that gives slightly better flexibility. Similar to what we had in two address code, add 4, right? That is in a one address code format. So whatever is there in every one address code is also two address code. Every two address code is also three address. Can you explain the advantage of one address code again? Okay, so one address code essentially makes expects that you don't have too much expectation from the hardware, right? For example, arbitrary random access could be one expectation from your machine, and we don't want that to be available. Or I mean, it may not be available in all the platforms in the 90s. Maybe today it is always going to be available. So they decided that I'm going to use some sort of stack machine, which is almost always going to be kind of portable across all the different platforms, right? Depending upon different hardware, depending upon different memories that are supported, and so on. So stack-based machine allows you to have your instructions executed only using a stack. There is nothing else that is required. You just require a stack pointer, and then the set of instructions just operate using these stack pointers. You are not assuming that there are some registers which are available, for example. For example, if you look at the assembly code, you are going to have, let's say, some sort of accumulator information, or some sort of, let's say there is base pointer, then there is an indexing. So even different addressing modes, you cannot assume those to be available across all the hardware. So you have to assume bare minimum. So what could be the reasonable bare minimum that one should expect from a hardware, right, when you want to execute the code? So Java designers decided that we are going to have it at the stack level. That is, we are going to assume that a stack is available. You may not even have random access in memory, but as long as stack is available, I am going to make use of those operations for executing instructions. That's what they decided. Any other concerns?
Sir?
Venkat, okay. Maybe I will continue using the headphone because there are more questions coming up.
Sir?
Yeah.
Sir, so like in the case of Java, like you said that even random access is not like they don't have an assumption for random access also. But how can it happen? Like they need to store these values somewhere, right? Like after computing the functions, they need some address to store it, right? Like they have to assume that they have RAM. Like they can't just have everything on stack, right?
So that is true. Um, so this one is about the intermediate representation. The bytecode that gets generated, that does, so the instructions operating on it do not use anything other than stack. But when you are executing the code, they do require heap. For example, all the objects that you create using new, those are going to be stored inside the heap, which are anyway going to require random access. Even within the stack, whatever are the variables that are stored within a function, those are going to require the random access, that is minus of 8 offset and so on, depending upon the base at the final code generation level, right? But that will be dependent on the machine. So the JVM is going to separate out this bytecode from the execution part. And the JVM is going to, depending upon what your target architecture is, it is going to allow certain ways of accessing. For example, a particular JVM, let's say on x86, will actually be optimized to work on x86. There might be another JVM which is specifically for the IBM AIX machine, right? So, IBM machine, and that might be optimized specifically for the IBM hardware. There might be some other for Spark and so on. So this part of execution is going to require you some sort of random access and so on, which is probably going to be made available at the source code level. But as far as the bytecode is concerned, the bytecode is only the instructions that are specified are going to be operating only on the stack. Does it operate also at, sorry, does it operate at the random access also? It should require random access, by the way. Yeah, you are right. Okay, I'll have to look this up, because you will require some sort of random access even at the IR level. Yeah, even to jump to a function, for example, which is there as part of the IR, you do require, yeah, okay. So I think only the expression evaluation probably is happening via the stack machine. The rest of the IR is probably not going to be using only the stack. So that makes sense. So expressions are definitely going to be evaluated using the stack machine. So that makes sense. But other things will still require IR at the IR will still require some sort of random access. So you are right, Venkat. Yeah. Yeah. So as Sarthak is suggesting, yeah, we'll have function calls which will require random access. That is correct. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. Any other concerns? Okay, good. So there could be other representations, by the way, not necessarily K address code or syntax trees. For example, you can have C as the intermediate representation. Right? Can somebody tell me why you will have C as the intermediate representation, or a high level language as an intermediate representation? Say it wisely. Yeah, that's fine. But why would you want it to? Because you already have a compiler for C. Sure, agreed. But can you give me a scenario where you might use C as the intermediate representation? Yes, it is widely used. Yes, you have a compiler for C, correct. But for example, will you convert a Fortran code to a C code? Yeah, that is correct. So what Vishnu and Nishchit are suggesting is that you might have an abstraction at a higher level than a procedural language like C or Fortran. Right? So for example, your SQL code can get converted into C. I mean, it doesn't, but you can think of converting it into a C code. Or you have a Prolog like language, right? Or a functional style language, and you might want to convert it into a C like language. Right? You might have a domain specific language. Right? For example, some language for specifying machine learning algorithms. Right? That you might want to lower. So that will have very special syntax, which will have regression. It will have different sort of data mining, let's say decision trees, etc., which will be inbuilt data structures and constructs and functions which might be available, for example. And those you are going to then generate code for. One option is to generate a highly efficient code using, let's say, C or C++. And then from there use a GCC or G++ to convert it back to the machine code. C++ to C may be easier. That's an interesting option. So although there are a lot of checks which we do as part of C++, it's a public, private, protected, and so on. There are other checks, for example, you might want to have, okay, there is constructor which gets automatically called and so on. Many of that is at the syntactic level, right? For example, even operator overloading, it is at the syntactic level. As long as you know about the types and so on, you'll be able to figure out at the compile time. You'll be able to figure out by looking at the syntax which function is going to get called and so on, except for virtual functions. So you might want to do those checks as part of the front end, then lower it to an existing language such as C, like Anirudh is suggesting, and then use a C compile. Right? Although that doesn't get used now, earlier C++ compilers actually did it that way. So when they were building, when STROS2 had built the language, one of the easiest things to do was to create a backend C code, right, as the IR, and from there generate the code for using GCC, because GCC was already existing. Good. All right. So, but today's world, typically, some of these higher level languages or domain specific languages will use C, C++, Fortran as the intermediate representation. Okay. So let's come to the syntax trees and DAGs. And you might want to use some of this as part of your intermediate representation. So when we represent it using a syntax tree, right? So you will show this particular expression using the syntax tree as shown below, which also encodes in which order the operators get executed and so on, right? So all that jugglery we have done as part of the while writing either the grammar or while writing the SDT. Now the question is that we are slowly moving towards generating optimized code, right? So I also want to generate optimized intermediate representation. And as you can see that B minus C expression is common in the same expression itself. So this sub expression B minus C, I don't want to generate once. I mean, I don't want to generate twice. I want to generate it once and reuse it in this. So one of the ways in which that can be done is using that 3 address code, where we will say that T1 equal to B minus C. And then wherever B minus C appears, I am going to replace it with T1. That is one way of representing. Another way is using, but I disallowed you from using, let's say, the 3 address code or some such address code. I want you to use syntax trees, in which case the syntax tree itself is insufficient to figure out that B minus C is common, right? For example, this part and this part are going to be replicated because of the trees. So trees represent the replicated expressions, and they cannot optimize the processing because it's a tree. When you want to optimize the processing, you want to have that B minus C subtree to be common, and as soon as you make it common, it gets converted into a DAG, right? So can you draw the DAG corresponding to this expression, which avoids this B minus C to be repeatedly done? I'll wait for a few seconds for you to draw. Okay, so it should, this particular edge should go from here to here to minus m, from star to minus, and that will take care of evaluating the expression. Now minus node has 2 parents, the 2 stars, and therefore you are going to have DAG structure, right? So that will look something like this. In addition, what I have also done, right, apart from this particular edge, is adding this particular part, right? What is the use of this particular edge? Memory efficiency. Okay, so yeah, so these are on the right lines. So the number of memory accesses should get reduced. We want to perform as much in the registers as possible. That is definitely one, and that is going to be possible when you have the expression representing that a variable gets loaded from memory only once, right? Because in the original expression it gets used twice. So load a, that might happen twice in the tree, and loading is accessing the memory, right? So you are going away from the chip, you are going away from the CPU which you are using, and therefore you will incur some sort of memory latency. Right? You might say that there might be caches, and once you have loaded it up, again, load is not really going to go to the memory, but you would like to reduce it as much as possible, right, at the intermediate representation or the code generation level itself. And therefore, one of the ways is using this. So here I am reusing the value that is stored inside A, and as far as registers are concerned, we are going to uh, come to that a little towards the later part of this, maybe tomorrow. Right? So this will definitely reduce the number of registers used, or definitely the memory latency. Okay. So if my expression grammar was corresponding to this, we had semantic actions corresponding to all of these expressions. For example, we said that for the first one, equal e deriving e plus t, we said that dollar dollar dot val equal to dollar one dot val plus dollar two dot val, and so on, right? So that is something which we did. Or if we wanted to build actually a syntax tree, then we'll say that dollar dollar dot node uh, 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 is going to be new node created using three operands, dollar one, dollar two, and dollar three, where dollar two is plus. Right? So that is what we have done earlier, and something similar is going to happen with respect to a tree. But when you have a DAG, right, what are the changes that you will require in these semantic actions corresponding to this production? Can somebody tell me that? Okay, let me ask you in this manner. Which of these productions will require a change if you want to build a DAG rather than a syntax tree?
Sir,
Yeah, Venkat.
sir, but like the changes we are suggesting won't they be specific to the problem that is given here? Because a tag is for any particular problem, right? And like when we are combining two nodes, they initially when we built the syntax tree, they had separate attributes also. Now those attributes will be combined as well. So won't it be problem specific, whatever changes we're making to this production table
Yeah, that's a
syntax?
good point. Yeah, that's a good point. One of the important assumptions in this particular discussion is that the expressions do not have any side effects. Right? For example, if I have plus plus b minus c, right, instead of only b minus c in the second expression, then that is creating some sort of uh, uh, side effect for this particular expression. For example, b minus c here in the first expression and b minus c in the second part, right, both these b minus c should actually be using the same values of b and c. Then only it makes sense to perform this DAG like thing. This is not only important at the expression level, but also important when you have a construct. For example, if you have a for loop and that is having an abstract syntax tree for the for construct, and let's say there is another for loop which is having a similar structure, you have to be sure that the statements that you are processing there do not modify something which changes the value at the other for loop or even other statement for that matter, right? So that side effect part does come into picture, and Venkat is right that this actually will make sense more for the expressions rather than across different kinds of constructs. That too within expressions when there are no side effects, or at least you are sure that the parts that you are using do not have the side effect. That you need to have some sort of understanding that this b minus c that I am using and this b minus c, these are going to be having the same values till the expression gets evaluated. This is going to be a little clearer as we go into this static single assignment. But for now, assume that there should not be any side effect within this expression. So that is correct. And even for different constructs, for example, if I have for loop and then there are bunch of statements within it, then there is another for loop bunch of statements within it. Only, or even in a single for loop, there are two statements which are the same, a equal to a plus 1, and then another statement a equal to a plus 1. That doesn't mean that these are both going to be, I mean, I can do away with one of them. Right? These are creating an effect. These are changing the value of some variable, some memory location, right? In this case, a specifically. In which case, the a's that are on the right hand side are not the same, and therefore we should not be able to use it in this particular manner. So this part gets done as part of the program analysis at the IR level or later. But yeah, you have to figure out that these these expressions are going to be non-mutable. I mean, not non-mutable, but these are side effect. Okay, any other concerns here? Okay, so you guys didn't tell me which of these productions will require changes. So the productions that require changes are going to be where we create a new node. We said that we are going to create new nodes for this, but as soon as we want the same load instruction to be used, which is going to be about the ID part, and I might be able to use the same constant, which might be related to this t arrow num part. That is one. The second aspect is about using this minus, right, which we are saying is the common part across these two. So here there might be some change required in case of e plus t and e minus t also. As far as e deriving t and t deriving parenthesized e are concerned, those are going to be as those were, because those are not generating any additional subtrees or new leaves. Right? So that is where you will require some changes. For example, there I'm just using some dummy function find, which is going to find that particular subtree within that DAG, and if that exists, then I'm going to not do anything. Otherwise, I'm going to make use of whatever our code was earlier, right? So I'm going to generate a new new node corresponding to $1 and $3. Any questions on this one? Okay. So if you don't have any question, then I have a question. The question is that when I'm performing this find, right, what am I really doing? Right? I'm finding a subgraph into this original graph, right? This is a DAG, but I can in general call it as a graph. And I'm searching for this particular subgraph, which is having $2 as the root and then $1 and $3 as its children within this subgraph. And that unfortunately is an NP complete problem. So how should we do that? Any suggestions? So when I'm looking for this b minus c expression, for example, I take this b minus c, right? And I look for a minus node having that b minus c expression completely embedded into this existing tree. If that exists, then I use the root of that subtree. If it doesn't exist, then I create a new node and then look for its operands. So that requires me to perform subgraph isomorphism. Subgraph isomorphism means search for a particular subgraph within a graph. That problem is unfortunately hard. So how should I solve this problem? Okay, so whenever the problems are hard, we typically go for approximations. Right? If the approximations work out, I'm able to give theoretical guarantees, all that works. For example, it is too approximate and so on. Yeah, so Prayas is saying our expressions tend to be small. Yeah, I'll come to that. Alternatively, if the approximation factors cannot be guaranteed, then you go for heuristics, which work in practice, but there is no theoretical guarantee. And what Prayas says is actually a very important practical point, that our expressions are really very small. We are just looking for minus or some operand or some operator with some operands. In this case 2, there might be 1, there might be 3. Right? If there is question mark colon, I might have 3, or there might be some other operator which might have 3 expressions associated with it as the operands. So this is an important point, that although in general you are doing subgraph isomorphism, what you have is a very specialized case which has only a constant number of items associated with it. In fact, this particular tree searching turns out to be not hard, right? So our expressions are really very small. That is one thing, constant number of things. Therefore, it will turn out to be not exponential. But the second part is that it's a tree that we are searching for, and therefore it will turn out to be searching for a tree within this will turn out to be easy. Right? So that is what we will do. That we are in a special case, and therefore don't get bogged down by that, oh, subgraph isomorphism is NP complete, therefore it's the end of the world and so on. Right? So what we do is some sort of value numbering. Well, in general, you can just search for example, if you want to search for B minus C, just search for a minus node. Search for a minus node in this DAG, which has B as the left child and C as the right child. That is what we want to search for. Whenever you are trying to generate the left hand side subtree for star, right? And you will find it, right? And searching that, you can see, is relatively easy, right? You can just have some sort of hashing and that will take care of this, right? Even if you perform a complete search within this DAG, it is still going to be linear in the size of the DAG. So that is not a problem. But there is another way in which this gets done, and that is value numbering, which I will probably explain tomorrow. Any quick questions? All right, so we'll stop here. See you tomorrow.